called The Fall of Icarus, and of course the sense of fall comes about through that descending brushstroke. I'm interested in this painting and to talk about this painting because it's probably the most simplified of any in the exhibition. I feel that it expresses a really strong sense of landscape, not necessarily a strong sense of place. I mean, there's no reason to think that this is Australia. It could just as easily be China, America. But it is landscape, definitely, and the idea of sky, horizon, and then the identification of this strong personal mark, which is an intimate thing, and he's done it at a small scale so that it doesn't become overblown. And the mark in painting is often has attributed to it that sense of personal investment. So in a way, this is an identification of self with landscape, the black mass being the landscape, the white mark that gives structure within that being the self. And of course, the vertical as well is often associated with a human figure in the landscape. If not a human figure, then at least some object or form that we can concentrate on as the focus, as the agent in the landscape. So there are a lot of deep concerns that this artist is trying to deal with in a very simple image. It's interesting to see how he has maintained the two levels of this image. On the one hand, the gesture, on the other hand, the black ground and the white sky. Through this scraping back, which is a literal and also representational link between the white and the black. Literal in that it actually makes little white, sticks come out of the mark, and representationally because if this was perhaps a tree or a river or some kind of path through the landscape, then we could almost, pretty easily accept these as paths off the main path or as branches off the tree. And so it's that holding of the representational aspect with an ultimately abstract image that I think is successfully achieved in this painting. I've reached my end point very quickly, but I could go on. Should I go on? Okay. I've talked about the works that I warm to. I don't know. As I said at the start, I'm a human being. I live and breathe. I have preferences. I don't like everything. Perhaps I'll talk about some other works, not to be an art critic, but simply to bring up the question of, well, what are they working with? If there are certain consistent concerns in the artists that I've looked at, and that represents one idea of what landscape could be, or at least a spectrum, then where are the other artists in the exhibition placed? Are they on the same spectrum, or are they just somewhere else in another field entirely? I would say that many of them are in another field entirely, so why don't we go to the next room and talk about one or two of those. Okay, Michael Lindemann's work, I don't know the title offhand, I'm sorry, I should. It is entitled Mapping the Landscape. And Michael Lindemann recently won the Wynne Prize for Landscape at the Art Gallery of New South Wales with quite a similar painting. Or was it, no, sorry, it was the Sulman Prize, I think, sorry? The Sulman for subject painting. I think he had a similar work to this, but it described still life rather than, anyway. Michael Lindemann's interesting because he's an exponent of conceptual art. I say that as like it's a new thing. I sound like I come from 1940 when I say an exponent of conceptual art. I like to have a dig at conceptual art because I feel that the impetus that was behind conceptualism in the 60s and 70s, not that I was there, but nevertheless, my awareness of what it had been in the 60s and 70s seems, it was a response against a certain deadness and status quo in the art world, where a particular brand of abstraction was being very heavily supported by museums, and other kinds of content that artists wanted to work with were not. It wasn't that they weren't permitted, but they were not likely to be taken up by the institutions. But of course what has happened in the successive generations is that various forms of conceptual art have been embraced by the institutions. And so the critique with which conceptualism initiated itself has entered the institutions. And now some of the kinds of works that I have talked about that engage with older painting traditions in a very positive way actually struggle to get a foothold in those institutions that represent those lineages. Am I making myself clear? And so the tables have been turned, and those who would criticise the heritage have become the interpreters of the heritage, or the next stage in the heritage, which could be, well, it's up to each of us to decide what we think about that. But I think it's suspect, and I think that it could be an exercise of power. But let's talk about this work in some detail, because I'm talking in generalities. So the work takes ads from, I suppose, the Trading Post or a similar sort of classified. And I suppose they're probably real, I don't know. You can imagine that these would appear in the Trading Post, these kinds of advertisements. And so the idea of picturing the landscape is denied, and instead we are presented with a range of attitudes towards the landscape. And a certain, I don't know, I can hear him laughing at these ads. I laugh at these ads. What is this, the one about the Russian, was Australian artist? I thought there was something about a Russian artist here. Sorry, I've got that wrong. That's the Australian. Large framed original oil painting, modern landscape, unsure of the Australian artist. Signature is difficult to read. It just makes mock of the high seriousness of galleries and museums, I suppose. But underlying that is a sort of an indifference to art. And that's not Michael Lindemann's indifference. He's presenting that indifference to us in this painting. He is saying, look at this. This is what people think about art. This is the level on which many people engage with art. It's about what's this worth. It's about who did this. It's in good condition. So it's sort of making us look at our own attitudes. But is that enough? Where does that game leave us? And although there is a sort of a visual reference to the landscape in the sort of the horizontal striping of the image, which alludes to, you know, ground, sky, cloud. I mean, we could, at a stretch, see this as a traditional figure ground painting dealing with colour and space. And yet, maybe if he really wanted us to enjoy it in that way, he could have played with these letters as having different weights. I mean, the landscape is inscribed with all kinds of variation, with air and light. There is a kind of a light in this image, there's a sort of a yellow-grey light. But I don't think he wants us, I think he wants to have that up his sleeve without really being very generous about it. So to me it seems like a very cool game that he's playing, and he's playing it well. And that as well is another reason I don't like it, because I don't think art is about playing the game well. I think it's actually about a more committed position than that. But there you go. But it stands out as well, doesn't it? So, yeah. Should I move on?
Yes, please.